In this presentation, we're going to be discussing consumer surplus. So now, when a market is in equilibrium, if the market is competitive, the price is going to adjust so that the quantity demanded of a good is going to be equal to the quantity supplied of that good. So now, every consumer who is willing and able to pay the market price will be able to buy just as much as they desire. Likewise, every firm will be able to sell as much as they desire at that given price. However, in this market transaction, some consumers are going to be willing to pay more. Remember, because of subjective value, every individual has a different value on each good and service. In some cases, consumers are going to value the good much more than the price they have to pay. So say the price of a good is $20, but they get $40 worth of enjoyment. They'll be willing to pay $40 for that. In that case, in this mutually beneficial exchange, they made themselves much better off, and they were willing to pay much more. So we're going to explore that, how consumers benefit much more than the price they have to pay. So now let's look at an example. Let's use Disney Plus. I don't know if anyone in this class has Disney Plus, but if you do, or even if you don't, think of how much you would be willing to pay for it. They did a recent poll of consumers, and they found that more than 25% of consumers were willing to pay more than $10 a month for Disney Plus. The actual cost of Disney Plus is $6.99 a month. So more than 25% of consumers saw even more value in Disney Plus than what they were being charged for it. And now 69% of consumers between ages 16 and 64, which is like their target demographic, indicated a willingness to pay something for the new streaming service. So they did see some value from it, although certainly some of those believe they would get less value than the $6.99 they're being charged. Now, economists use the idea of surplus to refer to the benefit that people derive from engaging in market transactions. So consumer surplus, this is going to be the difference between the highest price that a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the actual price that consumer pays. So for Disney Plus, for those 25% of consumers who were willing to pay more, they were willing to pay $10 for a $7 a month package. Their consumer surplus in this situation was $3, the amount of money that they would be willing to pay that they didn't have to pay. Similarly, the producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept for a good or service and the price it actually received. So say Disney would be willing to accept $6 a month for Disney Plus, but they're actually charging $7 for Disney Plus. In this case, the difference between 7 and 6 is 1, so they would get $1 a month in producer surplus. Now we're going to explore the consumer surplus more by deriving a demand curve for a product, in this case for chai tea. So let's suppose there are 4 people, and each of them are interested in buying a cup of tea. We can characterize them by the highest price that they're willing to pay. So we have this demand schedule on the upper right-hand corner of that figure, where it shows the consumer. So we have Teresa, Tom, Terry, and Tim, and we have the highest price each of them are willing to pay. So Teresa is willing to pay $6, Tom is willing to pay $5, Terry is willing to pay $4, and Tim is willing to pay $3. So if the tea is being sold at a price above $6, no cups of tea are going to be sold. None of the consumers value the cup of tea at whatever that price is above $6. At $6 a cup, only 1 cup will be sold. Teresa will buy a cup because she values it at $6, but none of the other, Tom, Terry, Tim, none of them value tea that highly, so it's not going to be worth it for them to give up that money. Now let's actually get into measuring consumer surplus. So let's say in this example that the price of tea is going to be $3.50 per cup. So if this is the situation, any of the consumers that value that cup of coffee or a cup of tea, at more than $3.50 are going to be willing to purchase that cup of tea. So now Teresa, she was willing to pay $6 for a cup of tea. That cup of tea is worth $6 to her. Because she only had to pay $3.50 for that cup of tea, she receives a net benefit of $6 minus the price she paid, so minus the $3.50, which gives her $2.50. That's her consumer surplus, is $2.50. So if you look at the figure on the right, the area A under the price that Teresa is willing to pay, that represents her net benefit, or her consumer surplus in the tea market. But not only Teresa gets a benefit, also Tom and Terry, they obtain consumer surplus. Tom was willing to pay $5 for a cup of tea, and he was only charged $3.50. So he gets $1.50 of consumer surplus, and that's represented by the shaded area B on the figure on your right. Additionally, Terry was willing to pay $4 for a cup of tea. She was only charged $3.50, so she receives 50 cents worth of consumer surplus. So the sum of all the areas between the price and the demand curve itself is called the consumer surplus. That represents that area. So you can think of consumer surplus as the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers have to pay. Let's assume the price falls to $3 from $3.50. So now Teresa, Tom, and Terry, each of them who were purchasing the tea before, each gain an additional 50 cents of consumer surplus. At this point, Tim is indifferent between buying the cup of tea and not buying the cup of tea. His well-being is going to be the same either way. He receives no more utility or no less utility. It's exactly equal because he values that cup of tea at exactly $3. So now the overall consumer surplus remains the area below the demand curve and above the new price. So in this case, the darker blue portions of the three rectangles are going to be the additional consumer surplus. Obviously, the market for tea is larger than just for consumers. When there's many consumers in a market, the demand curve is going to be a straight line, like we've been working with before. Unlike the small number of consumers, that gave us the weird step demand curve. But consumer surplus in this market is defined the same way as it was in that small market with just 4 consumers. It's going to be the area below the demand curve and above the price. So this graph shows what happens with the consumer surplus if the price is $2. Now the consumer surplus is going to be the area above $2 and below the demand curve. That triangle right there that you see in the figure on the right represents the consumer surplus. Let's look at consumer surplus in the real world. So having access to an internet connection is very beneficial for consumers. It provides us entertainment, it gives us information, it helps make paying our bills easier. There's a lot of different benefits that we get from having access to the internet. But just how beneficial is it? We can measure that by estimating the consumer surplus that's derived in the market. What we need to know in order to estimate this is the demand curve for broadband internet service and the price of broadband internet service. So back in 2006, the average price for broadband internet service was $36 a month. So two economists estimated the demand curve for broadband internet service, which we show in the figure on the right. The demand curve that they estimated, obviously they don't know the demand curve. They had to try to estimate it based off of quantities and the prices that people were willing to pay for. But the average price was $36 per month. And at that price, they estimated, or there were 47 million subscribers in that month. So the consumer surplus is going to be the area above the price, so above $36 a month, and below the demand curve. So using the formula for the area of a triangle, they estimated that the consumer surplus from internet was $890.4 million per month. Goods with different elasticities are going to have different levels of consumer surplus. So let's take a look at an example comparing two goods with different elasticities. Let's compare, let's say, bagels and fresh fish. In this example, we'll say that bagels has a large fan base that's sensitive to the price because of the alternatives that people could have for breakfast instead. At the same time, fresh fish has few substitutes, so there's a much less elastic demand for fresh fish. Let's look at supply and demand curves for each market. So on the left, we have the supply and demand in the market for bagels. Now, because demand for bagels is more elastic, we have a shallower demand curve. In this case, the consumer surplus is going to be the difference between the demand curve and the price being paid by consumers. So it's going to be that shaded gray area. On the right, we see fresh fish. The demand for fresh fish is less elastic. So now, similarly, the consumer surplus is going to be the area between the price and the demand curve. And it's represented by the gray area in the figure on the right. You can see goods that are inelastic, or the demand is inelastic, the consumer surplus is much higher. There are people who are willing to pay much more for a good than than the price they're actually being charged. Meanwhile, for the more elastic good, when the demand is more sensitive to price, consumers will not be willing to pay much more for a good than what they're being charged in equilibrium. So there's going to be less consumer surplus. Remember, when elasticity is high, consumer surplus is going to be lower. Consumers do not value the good much more than is being sold for in equilibrium, so they're getting a much lower amount of consumer surplus. When elasticity is low, when the demand for a good is inelastic, consumer surplus is going to be much higher. Consumers often value a good much more than is being sold for in equilibrium. In this case, for the fresh fish in our example, there were fewer alternatives, fewer substitutes for fish. So therefore, some people were willing to pay much more. When people are willing to pay much more than the price they're being charged in equilibrium, consumer surplus will be high.